Hello, I'm Casey Blair, the Programming Director for 4th Street Fantasy, and we are here for the 2021 virtual panel, Personalizing the Apocalypse, Meaningful Stakes on Grand Scales, with panelists Elizabeth Baer, Robyn Bennis, A.T. Greenblatt, Reuben Polling, Jasmine Silvera, and John Wiswell. Today's panel prompt is, one major roadblock that movements to address disasters of epic proportions encounter is individuals' inability to conceptualize them on a meaningful scale, not so vast that they throw up their hands and decide there's nothing to be done, and in a scope where they can understand potential effects not as far off problems for other people, but that require concerted action now. So we're going to let the panelists take it away for a while first, and then they will be back with us on Saturday, June 19th, 2021 at 4 p.m. Central for a live Q&A during the con. And without further ado, let's turn it over to today's moderator, Reuben Polling.
Thank you so much, Casey. I am so pleased to help bring everyone this pre-recorded 4th Street panel. So a little intro. It's hard to think of anything more universal than the end of the world, and yet that very universality is what makes it, I think, deeply personal. If everyone experiences an event, literally everyone, then the only thing that makes that event distinct is each person's individual perspective thereof. That makes it an incredibly powerful tool for writers, especially in fantasy. It's a way we can put everything we've built to the test, from character to world building to institutions, all through the same stress test. But the question is, how to make this apocalypse truly matter beyond the Sturm und Drang and the pyrotechnics? How to make your readers fully invested in this destruction and thus in your creation? So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, let's introduce our panelists. As mentioned, I'm Reuben Polling. I am a Seattle-based fantasist, sports writer, rabble-rouser, various dabbler. My credentials aren't really important because I am just here to tap into the beautiful minds of our panelists and feast on the delicious goo inside. Let's introduce ourselves. Bear, would you like to introduce yourself?
I just want you to know that I've been exposed to a lot of toxic chemicals and my brains are probably poisonous. Was that convincing? Was that at all convincing? Hi.
Wouldn't stop me.
I'm Elizabeth Baer. I write science fiction and fantasy and sometimes mysteries and sometimes science fiction and fantasy mysteries. My most recent novel is Machine, which is a science fiction mystery hospital drama, because why have one genre when you can have three? And I'm here because I like to blow things up in fiction.
Very important disclaimer. Thank you. Next, John Wiswell.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Wiswell. I'm a disabled writer who lives where New York keeps most of its trees. I am a relatively recently minted finalist for the Nebula and Locus and Hugo Award for Best Short Story. And I've been publishing short fiction for about a decade in places like Uncanny Magazine and Nature Futures, Fireside, Pseudopod. And I've published quite a few stories set either during the apocalypse or sometime in the aftermath. And then I have the privilege of having a few stories where readers have argued with me about whether or not they are post-apocalyptic, that I might have written more of them than I thought. So I'm quite excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Next, Robyn Bennis.
Hey, I am from Madison, Wisconsin. I am the author of some books that you can just Google because I'm tired of talking about them. I am here because I have accidentally ended several worlds in parallel timelines.
Well, I hope none of those people are watching. Next, A.T. Greenblatt.
Hi, I'm a short story writer based out of Philadelphia. I write a lot of stories that cross genres too. I also like to explore what happens when the world ends and what do we do in the aftermath. And I have stories, I should say, in Uncanny, Clarksville, Beneath the Skies, and one coming out on tour in September, which I'm excited about.
Very cool. And finally, Jasmine Silvera.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I am the author of 4 books in the Grace Flood's urban fantasy romance and paranormal romance series. I also sort of accidentally ended a world to start a series, and so I am writing in the world after.
Real quick, something I should have said up front, just a disclaimer that due to the subject matter of this panel, we are going to be touching on real world apocalyptic events, ranging from the sort of slow rolling one we've all been contending with recently to past occasions of more localized apocalypses, those perpetuated on a people. If that is a subject that you are really not interested in dealing with right now, we will not think any the less of you for not being interested in this panel, and we thank you for observing. So let's get started. I'd like to start with a straightforward question. It would seem really counterintuitive for readers to have trouble caring about the end of the world, but I'm sure that's something we've all encountered when reading or watching, just an earth-shattering kaboom that failed to register for us. So what do you all think is the biggest challenge to overcome when writing an apocalypse or about an apocalypse? AT?
Well, I think of the quote, I think it was a strong quote, where he said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000 is a statistic." And I think it's, as humans, we have a hard time imagining big catastrophes. So I think sometimes, especially in genre fiction where you see a city explode, you're kind of like, oh, that's awful, but you don't really understand what catastrophe that is. Partially because we see it all the time.
Sure. Sort of, I guess, the same problem as the, the death of 100 stormtroopers versus one named character.
Right, exactly.
Bear, did you have?
I was basically going to say the same thing AT just did.
Do it.
And it's both the statistic thing and the genre thing, and the way catastrophes are so often treated in genre as kind of background noise. The world ends, and then all the characters we care about go off and have an adventure and rebuild the society that the author would desperately love us to all wish we had, or possibly a catastrophic dystopia, or both. Because I think one person's dystopia is another person's ideal society.
That's a good point. We have John?
Yeah, there's a different attachment issue I think a lot of people have with different post-apocalyptic stories. Is there's such a wealth of them now that one has trouble finding what is novel or what is particularly the soul of a new apocalyptic story. You're not going to be the one to invent zombies. We're now multiple generations past the point at which people first even watched Night of the Living Dead, which didn't invent them, just introduced them to a new audience. And so there is an issue in the post-apocalyptic fiction and apocalyptic fiction that often fails in finding where in the point of view and the cast, or in your premise, or in your apocalypse, is that thing that is unique. What is supposed to speak to the audience in particular from this story. Look at outrageous success of something with imaginative brilliance like N.K. Jemisin's Fifth Season. It's a wealth of creativity. The apocalypses are cyclical. So there's an intrigue. The people of the world have a direct connection to why it's cyclical and what's happening, and that affects what they can do. And then as you go further, there's some wild plot beats about the people in the world. So it manages, as Jemisin is brilliant for, to be novel on every major front that an apocalyptic story can do, or generally operates in. And so I find often I don't demand any story do all of them, but finding the thing that makes this next apocalypse tell something that's distinct from all the others is the big crucial point for me.
Yeah, and I think the thing that the Broken Earth trilogy really did that was novel, or at least novel enough for me, was Yeah, there's in a different author's hands who want to tell a different kind of story. It could have been a very much a black comedy, you know. It's it's the end of the world again. Just a world that keeps ending and renewing itself in some of the most pyrotechnic ways imaginable. I think also when you mentioned, Bear, about sort of the difficulty we often run into of a story that starts with the end of the world, but now let's get to the important part. That makes me immediately go to The Stand, a book that is near and dear to my heart, as well as many others here, which really, I think, succeeded greatly because Stephen King had, 1,000 pages to go, let's get through the apocalypse, let's make that horrifying and spine-chilling and very effective, and then the story starts. Most of us don't have that luxury. In fact, Stephen King didn't even have that luxury at first. He had to release a second edition. So I mean, just write more is a solution that doesn't always work, right?
And I think, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Robyn.
And I think, the key issue there is have room to zoom in, right? It is, that is the counter, or rather the complement to AT's comment from Stalin, or rather. That doesn't sound great, but
this is not the first panel I've moderated with multiple mentions of Stalin, but it's usually a very different topic.
The guy had his fingers in a lot of pies. But yeah, if you're zoomed out on a tragedy, it doesn't matter how purple your prose. It doesn't matter how intricately you describe that. It is just stuff that is happening. You zoom in on one person who is in the middle of all that, who is feeling what is happening, who is on the pointy end of what is happening. And that is the kind of thing that readers almost can't help but connect to. Like even, it really takes effort for a reader to not connect at that point.
Bear, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I wanted to loop back slightly to the thing you said about the iterating apocalypses in the 5th season, and how that could be a dark comedy, which is which is the way it's treated in the 3-body problem, right? Is there are iterative apocalypses, and they are, after a while, they sort of become darkly funny, and I think that's intentional. So, but also to elaborate on what Robyn was just saying, I think the one way you can sometimes bring an emotional impact to like large scale overview stuff is to just be extremely clinical, because then you invite the reader to supply the emotion.
Very good point. Yeah, I think that's a writing trick I've heard in every other context, is to make the reader do the work for you. Because I know that if I'm very into a story, I just am never going. My brain is never going to stop going about it. So I am interested, one of the things that came up pre-panel, and that we've kind of circled around, is that we have this sort of default coded view of an apocalypse as a mass destructive event, with whether it's meteors and tsunamis or, global pandemics, that sort of thing. And there is such a thing as a localized apocalypse, of peoples and communities can be destroyed, whether literally or through the kind of change and displacement and fragmentation that just renders unrecognizable the lives of the survivors. And how suited, I think fantasy may have a unique toolkit for building apocalyptic events on that sort of more localized scale. And what are some of those tools, and how can we do that? Any thoughts? Yeah, Jasmine.
Well, I guess, technology changes things, right? I mean, the world is bigger or smaller depending on how much access you have to what's going on in the rest of it. So, one of the advantages of the smaller scale apocalypse, at least for writing, is that you don't have to worry about things like cell phones. And so, which is, we're all, everybody, I think mystery writers too would like for cell phones to all just disappear. But, you know, so that like there's that like on the very simplest level, I guess. And you know, in terms of scale, one could argue that it's like maybe not the entire world, but it depends on what your entire world is and how far it extends. So if your entire world is your village or your city or, you know, your island, and that's a story, well, that's it. So like that's the scale wise relative is the same as, I don't know, you know, the apocalypse or the expanse slamming asteroids into Earth, right? So in Babylon's Ashes. So yeah, so I guess it's the relative scale helps. It's definitely a lot easier to control all the moving pieces when you have fewer to have to move. Yeah.
AT, did you have something?
Yeah, just to add on to that, the advantage of doing a small scale one is to show, you can also show a lot of contrast. So like, you know, I'm thinking of, I believe it's St. Vincent's, the volcano that erupted a couple weeks ago on the Caribbean island, and it basically caused a lot of havoc. But one of the things that people are saying is like the rest of the world just is going on with this business while they're dealing with this major catastrophe. And they kind of, at least the storytelling is a great tool to kind of show how devastating something is when you can see what normal life looks like in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, you know, to take a historical bent on it, I have been watching The Last Kingdom based on Bernard Cornwell's Saxon stories. Finally getting around to that. I love all kinds of, you know, Viking shit. And, you know, reading the historical sources, it was viewed in the British Isles as this apocalyptic event, you know, very much like the end of the world, these, you know, the heathen invaders, yada, yada. And it was, you know, this genuinely transformative event that changed kind of the history of that corner of the world. But the thing is, that corner of the world was really so small. Like, it obviously has outsized importance to us in the English speaking world, but like, you know, at that time in like the 8th and 9th century, like even in Europe, you've got, you know, Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus flourishing, the Byzantine Empire in full swing, just like the British Isles were this complete backwater, relatively speaking, and yet they were undergoing an apocalypse. And because of, you know, future course of history, it takes this sort of outsized importance in our own conception, I think, of apocalypse, of that kind of historical twist. John?
Yeah, to extend on what Jasmine and AT were talking about, I'm fascinated by the two potential dichotomies within the smaller scale apocalypse of use of in and out group. Because if you have a smaller scale apocalypse, necessarily you have an out group of probably the rest of the world that hasn't had to suffer the same incident. And in your H.G. Wells encounter, your War of the Worlds encounter, there's a direct antagonist that's a tertiary out group. And there you can explore what it is to be the victim or even the perpetrator of an apocalypse on another. Whereas with the lens of science fiction fantasy, you can also have an inexplicable, uncanny, or cosmic apocalypse and explore what the relationship is where there is no direct antagonism, but you exist in a small scale apocalypse where the rest of the world is privileged to not have that experience, and what it is when you really need resources. And since we're going to talk about real life events, and I have a hard time not thinking about the friends that I lost to the AIDS HIV epidemic, and that, you know, anti-queerness in my country has led to a lot of people with a lot of resources not helping. And there's a lot to be explored within non-directly antagonistic small scale apocalypses or destructions. And we can argue about what fits the definition of apocalypse there. It gives you a very different conflict, two very different dichotomies for conflict that let us explore a lot of what is different to experience wide-scale loss.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the idea of an apocalypse happening, and, you know, what if the apocalypse happened and nobody cared, right? I mean, to get around that. Did anyone else want to take that and run with it, or got a little mining to do there? I am, you know, so I do want to swing to, we're using the word apocalypse and it kind of registers with everyone. But I feel free to fact check me on this, because I'm Jewish and not a very good one at that, but I understand the word comes largely, our usage of it comes from the New Testament book of Revelation. The word originally means uncovering, and it has to do with revelation, which is framed in the New Testament as, the end of the world and so forth. And I think that cultural touchstone really informs the way we think of what an apocalypse is here in the Western world. Do y'all have any thoughts on how that informs it and what other apocalyptic concepts, we can draw from as writers? Anyone?
Well, sorry, go ahead, Robyn.
Yeah, you definitely see that tendency. It's almost has become almost ubiquitous. This idea that like there's the last Trump, and then the proceedings get underway. Whereas you don't see that very much historically. There's rarely like a defined moment in historical apocalypses, with the exception of maybe, the conquest of the Americas, where you can point to like one moment where things began. But to pivot from that catastrophe to some friendly storytelling advice, I don't think it's not necessarily bad writing to go with the ubiquitous and, in this case, kind of Christian kind of standard that was set there, because it fits neatly into storytelling. It's a type of story that people are already kind of familiar with, even if they're not explicitly familiar with it. They're kind of soaking in it. And the familiar can often give you a little bit of a bridge to your reader.
Good points. Jasmine, did you?
Yeah, ultimately, I think that's spot on in terms of like, it's just, there's not a single moment. Like I love the ones the stories that I'm drawn to that are apocalyptic stories are the ones where things where lights just start shutting off and radio stop working, and there's just I think of, what was the one with the two girls in the forest? It's like, it just, you don't know, like, does this just end, or does this, like, is this coming back? And it would be nice if somebody would just come up and say, okay, look, it's the end of the world. Things aren't coming back. You better figure out how to survive. But how much time does one waste sort of waiting for things to sort of, is this going to arise again? So like, as a very lapsed Catholic, I get that, that desire for there to be like a trumpet. It's like, somebody please send me the text message that says it's the end of the world. And there were so many times during this last year where things would feel like incredibly like dire, but also very mundane. And like, so then I was wondering, well, is this it? Like, maybe we all had it wrong. Maybe it's about the toilet paper and the lack of yeast in the store when you're going to bake bread. Like what's the signpost for the apocalypse here? So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a desire for some notification of some kind.
For sure. Fair?
I also think that one of the interesting places to find tension in an apocalyptic story is between the people who are like, no, this is really bad, and the people who are in denial. Because there's also another kind of story where they're the people who are sort of pushing the apocalyptic narrative, and people who are pushing the, like, repair and mitigation narrative, where the protagonist, the audience, might be on the other side of that. Like, there's that guy who's like, oh, it's the end of the world, I'm gonna go hole up in my garage with my guns and my Doberman pincher, and 27 cases of MREs, and meanwhile, all around him, his neighbors are like, well, I guess we need to start organizing the community and maybe set up a soup kitchen.
Yeah.
So, there's, it's interesting how like both of those narratives sort of coalesce around a set of like, there's like a narrative singularity in there that you can't get information out of, but you can see all the stuff swirling around.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure. I had AT and then John.
I think that's what I liked about Terrapins, because sooner or later everything falls into the sea. It's an apocalyptic story where like all the rich people get on yachts and never dock because the world is falling apart. And then she kind of drops in there that like people are just forming communities and making things work on the mainland. Like no one's like knifing each other just to survive. It has many different glimpses of what life in a society where the lights don't turn on anymore look like, and the bridges fall down, and what do you do? And this is diversity advances. I like that a lot. Kind of
Yeah.
made me rethink what an apocalypse looks like.
Yeah, it is kind of fun to think about apocalyptic fiction really existing side by side with the sort of like problem solving fiction that you find very often, especially in sci-fi, of like, you know, you need the right kind of wrench and the right kind of problem solving brain for it. You know, that kind of approach when the problem is we are an island now. This used to be inland, a mountain, and now it is an island. John?
Yeah, to build on that, what really crucially attracts me to apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction is basically you tend to have stories where the forces that put you in your box or that allow you to be in your box go away. And often you'll see like zombie fiction is basically like, well, what if the whole world's a playground now? And just go loot anything, and now all the rules are gone. Everybody still can make Simpsons references, so it's not a secondary world fantasy, but the rules of engagement in society are gone in some way. And what are you going to reinstitute, and what still matters to you? What are you when either the social pressures that forced you to do things go away, or the social set networks that supported you go away? And how do we continue to provide for each other? To go back, we've already referenced the stand once, so here's the second stand. But my favorite part of the stand is when they all get together after their long, horrible road, and they're like, all right, how do we turn the lights back on? I've got these skills, you've got these skills. I can facilitate a communication. Who knows engineering? Who knows plumbing? Who could do manual labor? Who can look after other people? That rebuilding is so enriching, and I could take a lot more of it. But because I love those changes about, well, what do you become when things shift a little bit? I'm very attracted to books like Max Brooks's World War Z and H.G. Bells's Sleepover, which are both basically every chapter, here's another person who's experiencing the same apocalypse as everybody else in a different way. Everybody knows World War Z, hey, zombies. But Sleepover is basically an apocalypse where nobody can sleep. It's insomnia day after day. And what happens 2 days after nobody can sleep? 3 days. And at the 3-day point, it's like the people running the daycare where parents aren't coming anymore to pick their kids up. And day after day after day, how do we support each other? How do we keep each other from losing it? And everybody has their own take on it. So like by day 4, when you meet the hitman who's losing it, you're like, I don't have a lot of sympathy for whatever you're gonna do, dude. You're not my favorite. Whereas like the gamers who are like, look, we're really tired and we can't do much, but we're really used to staying up all night on caffeine and doing one task. So they go to somebody and they're like, what's the one thing you need a lot of people to do right now? Because we think we could probably do that tonight. And I adore how stories like that flip through many different takes and many different experiences on a catastrophic event can show you both how different we are, and in cases how we can come together and help each other through the worst times, which that's my catnip. I'll read that sort of thing forever.
Yeah, Jasmine?
Can I just circle back to something that I think John and AT touched on, and also John, is that this idea that there's some class lines that get exposed in interesting ways in Apocalypse, and an opportunity to explore that. I mean, not to nobilize poverty at all, but people who've had less for a long time know how to make do with less and have generally to generalize, survival instincts and an ability to like cobble things together and in some cases work together. Like, I think it's interesting that, when you've got especially when you're focusing on the hero story, it's always like people escape. They do this in The Expanse, right? The rich people all fly off and leave Earth. They go to Luna. The rich people get in the yachts. They're like out of here when things get bad. They go into their bunkers with their 74 cases of MREs and, their tiny little dogs. But it's like people who have been either living through apocalypse for one way or the other on the small scale in their lives that are like, okay, we got to figure this out. There's no boat. There's no spaceship. There's just whatever we have resource left. And I think that's an interesting opportunity to explore apocalypse as a writer. And those stories do, for me, have more resonance because there are people who are addressing from already a lack of resource. So, they haven't benefited from supremacist culture that places them first. So they have a lot less to lose when they hit the ground and then maybe potentially can be more resilient. Again, like generalizing and not to nobilize oppression, but there's definitely some interesting storytelling ability there.
There.
So I'm actually in the middle of writing a science fiction series in which takes place 600 years after all the rich people fucked off to space in generation ships. and what the people who were left behind built. So what you're saying, Jasmine, is so incredibly close to my heart. And what they build is a much more communalistic and pluralistic society, which has its own drawbacks. But I think you are just so absolutely correct that there is this sort of libertarian idea of civilization will collapse and then we'll all live in our walled bunkers. This is a slight left turn, but do you guys know about the town in New Hampshire with the bears? Okay, yeah. Oh,
Please
Robyn,
tell us
yeah.
about the town in New Hampshire with the bears.
Okay,
I love that town.
So yes, this took place a mere like 3 hours drive north of me. So, there was this little town called, there still is sort of this little town called, I think it's Grafton, New Hampshire, where they tried to build, a bunch of people from away tried to sort of move in and build a libertarian free state in this little tiny town. And you can get all the details in this wonderful book called A Libertarian Walks into a Bear. But basically what happens is when you start defunding all of your town services, people do whatever they want. Not only do you have everything burning down and, no roads and the roads crumbling, but the bears move into town. Because there's nobody doing anything like enforcing town ordinances about not feeding the wildlife. So this small town basically experienced an apocalypse of individualism, because nobody wanted to take the long-term townspeople were outvoted, and the people who the newcomers who had moved in order to deregulate society had no idea what any of those rules were for and why you shouldn't bring boxes of donkeys to your local black bears.
So let the bears eat the rich. That's the solution.
Let the bears eat the rich. Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
They're
Put it on a
extremely
t-shirt
caffeinated
next
bears.
week. Look for that from my Cafe Press store.
So
No, I mean,
all
really
about
like-
bears.
Yeah, I really like kind of tying that concept to what you said a little ways back, Jasmine, about like, the apocalypse is an opportunity to take cell phones away from your characters. It really is, it's removing the door stoppers. It's removing some of the structures, and they can be like, physical things or like the sort of class markers. Obviously, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, both as in terms of what we're writing and what we're drawing from in real life, are like, huge, like destructive, traumatic events. But there's also the sort of, it's to talk about another topic. Different ways of looking at the apocalypse is more kind of the Hindu tradition of destruction and creation happening at the kind of hand in hand of like, okay, you take this away, what takes its place? What happens when you what happens when we get rid of cell phones? What happens when we get rid of Elon Musk? Like what
Send in the bears.
Did you want to say something, John?
Are there bears on Mars?
Not yet.
I just noticed AT.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to tie something into Jasmine's point where there's also this trope in apocalyptic fiction that disabled people die first. And I think it's kind of untrue because we are people who have been adapting in present day society. So we have those skills to adapt and figure out how to make things work from what we have. So, yeah, that was my point.
No,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a really good
great
point.
I can't think of like anyone being, more equipped to like, oh, do you need some help surviving a hostile environment? Because I have some tips, right?
Right.
I want to say that any science fiction story that begins with like the apocalypse happened, but like disabled people's network survived it. Like, I'm gonna finish reading whatever that is. You give me that on like page 1 and I'm there.
Yeah, I really like Station 11, but the one thing I hated about that was the one disabled character decides to kill himself in the apocalypse. And I'm like, honestly, if he's been through this much already, that's not going to be his go-to solution.
Sorry, Robyn, did you have something?
No, except to just, agree vehemently.
That's good. Bear?
I have a lot of questions overall about Station 11 in medical science. I realize that that's not what the book is interested in, but
Yeah, well, it does make, that's actually a really interesting craft point about like, there's a lot of avoidance stuff you can do, especially in fantasy, of like, I don't want to have to learn about this thing, so it's not going to be in my world, right? I'm writing a pre-gunpowder fantasy because I'm just not a gun person, and I don't want to like have to bug enough of my gun friends to get it right. But like, there's sort of a double-edged sword with apocalyptic fiction in that regard, I think, where like on one hand, you can kind of take away the stuff you don't want to write about and learn about. But on the other hand, you're just, if you're writing an entire breakdown of society, that means you kind of got to pay attention to all of society so you can break it. It's a real test of your fact-checking skills. Fair.
I have some, problems with the sort of baked in 70s racism in The Stand. But one thing I did like about it was its treatment of disabled people. The idea that when you have that people are intrinsically useful, and that even that being useful is not the point, is very baked in, and I appreciated that. Another property that I think handles it pretty well is Zombies Run, which is it's a game, but it's also a narrative, which takes place in a post-apocalyptic future, involving, spoilers, zombies. And there is a lot of discussion in the context of the narrative about accessibility and accommodations, and it's a very woke zombie apocalypse in a pretty good way. Woke zombie apocalypse, that's my new brand.
I think woke zombie apocalypse is just like a Federalist headline. So I wanted to touch on something that really has been interesting me since I signed up for this panel. We talk a lot about the question of scale when it comes to apocalypse, and that's sort of like one of the key things. How big to make your earth-shattering kaboom, and where to locate it, and how closely to zoom in on the details. But distance isn't the only unit of measurement. I'm curious what people think about the scale of time as it pertains to the apocalypse, and what you can do with like playing with a world set, a story set with a long ago apocalypse as opposed to a recent or an impending one, or an apocalypse that happens immediately versus something in drawn out stages. And if I can ramble for just a second about, I don't want to say one of my favorite series, but one of the ones that takes up the most real estate in my head is Scott Baker's Prince of Nothing series, which the title of the meta series is The Second Apocalypse. And it's a big, like, gigantic fuck off epic fantasy set 4,000 years after the world ended in the Bronze Age, that, you know, Sauron and the orcs essentially destroyed all but a tiny corner of the world. And the initial trilogy really, I think, does a fantastic job of locating us in a civilization built in the ruins. There's a sense of depth to it, and one of the main characters is essentially a conspiracy theorist wizard who has the very unfortunate situation for a conspiracy theorist of his being true. And what happens is that he's a character who remembers the apocalypse, that every night he has dreams of it that are drawn from reality. And it's this great way of sort of citing the reader right in this incredibly traumatic, destructive event while still showing you how removed the rest of the world from it, that, you know, the person who knows that it really happened comes off as, you know, the wizard equivalent of, like, you know, the lone gunman on the X-Files, this complete wacko. So I thought that was, like, one, you know, for all that series' other problems, of which there are many, that was a really fantastic way of, I immediately bought into, like, that sense of apocalypse. So yeah, what do other people think about time as it relates to the scale of the end of the world? John?
Yeah, I think time lets you play with how much gets recontextualized and how feverishly it gets recontextualized. I'm a big sucker for a post apocalypse where somebody's like, "What's a bibla?" Just like trying to read the cover. Just any time that something is horribly misunderstood, you know, like we're the hermit crab apocalypse, and all the people are gone, but they're just flooding all the Tesla plants to steal chassis to wear as their shells. Like anything like that, I find it adorable. And while you can do wild, humorous things with it, you can also do the context of how much is supposed to have been processed. You know, you get something like Meg Elison's Book of the Unnamed Midwife, and you're watching her day after day contextualizing this horrible fever that is killing off pregnant people. And her learning, like, well, then I have to, like, so our main character is male passing, although she is a woman, identifies as a woman, and she specifically male passes to mess with the society that's starting to establish itself in order to do good that people would prevent her from doing if she didn't. You contrast that with something like The Last of Us, where there's a prologue and there's a hard cut, and, you know, we have prologue sad dad and 5 years later sad dad, or 18 years later sad dad, and you see that jump from the heartbreak of the moment to the resignation, to the soreness, the slowness, but still wearing the watch that his daughter got him right the night that it all went down. It allows you to appreciate, okay, this is the kind of context of emotional resonance we're going to be playing with, is the pain of the old world has started to rust over. Then you could do the much bigger scale to something like Walter Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz, where people just don't know what blueprints are. And they find, like, schematics for things for the first time, and they're like, is this a religious text? I don't know, let's take it to the monastery. And it, you know, then we unpack from there that, like, the pain is rusted over so much that people don't even know the apocalypse is a thing that they are suffering from. It's that much of a part of history. So I think the scale lets you play with context. That's my big thing.
I like that. AT?
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with that. I think that's one of the powers of video games and movies versus book. It lets you see scale in a way that I think books sometimes have a really hard time conveying. I'm thinking of two examples. One is Horizon Zero Dawn, which is set in far future, where you're seeing, like, the remnants of a slightly more futuristic world than we live in now. But it's like everything is collapsed, like only pieces of skyscrapers are there, and it's covered in ivy and stuff like that. And the people who live now are tribal and don't really have any answers for what came before. Like, it's been lost. And it's an open world game, so you spend a lot of time running around and collecting coffee mugs sometimes, because no one knows what a coffee mug is, but this guy thinks they're really cool and wants all of them. So and that, like, it's a fascinating way to look at the after effects, way beyond the people they affect in the moment. And my other example is slightly different when we're talking about scale and how we have a hard time visualizing it. I think it was a scene in Gone with the Wind where in the camp where all the wounded people and the camera zooms out and they realize it's like a whole field. It's like one person and then the camera zooms out and you realize the whole field is just covered in wounded people. And I still remember that thing even though I watched it like 20 years ago.
Stuff that sticks with you. I really love the idea of the post-apocalyptic collector, like a Mad Max warlord who's just collecting Funko Pops, doesn't know what they are. They're like some sort of religious trophy there.
What AT just said about scale and that like zooming in, zooming out thing as a way to create impact also plays into the time thing. I was just thinking about Connie Willis's Doomsday book, where you have you have an apocalypse that's taking place in the past and an apocalypse that's taking place in the future simultaneously. And spoilers for a 30-year-old book. The statute of limitations is over. The protagonist is a time-traveling historian who accidentally gets sent back to the Black Plague. And meanwhile, in the future, there's a massive influenza epidemic going on, which I think is actually supposed to be, it's been ages since I read this book, but it's supposed to be started by the 1918 flu. So there's like a historical link there too. And the way the two timelines are juxtaposed is really fascinating and is used to sort of build out thematic elements. And there's also this thing where we get a very in-depth single person, narration of the events in the 14th century. And then we have another character come in at the end of the book who walks in as a naive witness and sees the contrast between two places, basically. It comes back in time to rescue the person who's essentially been stranded there because everybody in the future was dying too. Oops, bad day at work, everybody. And there's a really effective like camera thing going on there. I don't know how else to describe it. Where we get this, we see how bad it could be, and then we see the place that's been ameliorated and it's still terrible. But there's still that sense of catharsis when you get there because you know how bad it could have been.
Yeah, like that. So we are getting on your time, as Casey has checked with me. I wanted to make sure on this question of scale, Robyn or Jasmine, Robyn and or Jasmine, I would love to hear from either of you on this subject, if you have any thoughts. If not, that's fine too.
It's been super well covered. I would just say, like, Octavia Butler did it super well. I think also she does really short scale and then really long scale really well in the same series, and in the same world. So like if you haven't read, it's just thinking like the difference between parable books and then like getting all the way to like Clay's Arc and Pattern Master. Like it's just such a different scale, and all of those are very effective in very different ways. So that's like grandmaster stuff there, though. So us mere mortals will have to live with what we got.
Oh God, I can't believe the Pattern Master books didn't come up until 2 minutes left in our panel.
Well, I proved myself wrong because I was like, wait a minute, Parable of the Talents, they do build the ship to leave the planet. So I just debunked my own theory about people who have to stay behind, choosing to stay behind and work it out. They actually do just piece out of the scenario.
Robyn,
And
what
to
do you-
second, yeah, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. That is a masterclass in how to explore present day society through an apocalyptic lens. Most apocalyptic writers, you see them shining through in their view of other people once societies, once the bounds of society have been broken. And some of those views are very nihilist and cynical, and some of them are very nuanced. And if you want to see how to do it nuanced, Parable of the Sower.
I guess a good, sort of closing thought is, well, what did Octavia Butler do about this? Is kind of, when in doubt. So yeah, we are
Get a
getting
t-shirt.
about.
T-shirt. What would
Yeah.
Octavia do?
We are getting about to the end here. Did anyone have any closing thoughts they would desperately like to pitch into this whirling vortex of Brad? This analogy's not going anywhere good. No?
If the world ends, please only steal as much toilet paper as you need.
Somebody send me a text message because I will have no idea what's going on.
Yes. I do think that's one great thing to think about. It is sort of the apocalypse as information, an information apocalypse. It's the idea of like, okay, it's all happening, but does everyone know about it?
The apocalypse will be tweeted.
I
I
got
have
you.
major FOMO of the apocalypse.
Sure to invite
Instagram apocalypse influencers.
Oh, God. Halloween costume. Okay. Well, I think that just about wraps us up here. Thank you all so much for sharing. Thank you to everyone who has been listening to this. In the future, if the world has not ended by the time this panel is posted, then it will be our delight to welcome you to a Q&A session on Saturday the 19th. Until then, this has been 4th Street, Personalizing the Apocalypse. Thank you all so much for being here at the end of all things.